Thank you so much. Now I'm wondering, what on earth did I say last year? Boy. Life is unfair. I'm sure the families of Walter Scott are saying that. I mean, you know, he was stopped for a routine traffic violation, and he's dead. Life is unfair. I am an American of Japanese ancestry, and I wanted to give you some examples of some of that unfairness as it's played out in my family. My grandfather came to the U.S. Working as a houseboy because he was trying to earn money to send back to Japan to his family. He had to save his money so that he could return to Japan in order to get married, because at that time it was illegal for him to marry a white woman, and the law made it really difficult for women from Asia who were single to come to the United States. He couldn't become a U.S. citizen because he wasn't white, and there was a Supreme Court case that said that. He couldn't own land even though he wanted to start a farm because he couldn't become a citizen, because he wasn't white. And with each of these examples, he really had no recourse. His daughter, my mother, at the age of 10, with about 110,000 other Americans of Japanese ancestry, despite being born here, despite being a U.S. citizen, she and the rest of her family were all interned in a very bleak and dusty, desert-like area in part of Wyoming. They weren't allowed to really take a lot with them, just what they could carry in these cardboard suitcases that her elder sister had purchased for the family. She remembers that her family had just planted crops in some fields that they leased, that they were never going to be allowed to harvest. She had to leave behind her dog. She had to see that everything the family owned sold for a pittance, or just given away, or just left behind. In camp, they had to live in these wooden barracks where the dust would blow between the cracks in the walls. One hot summer day, her sister was able to get passes from the warden so that they could go into the nearest town, because it was really hot, and they were all thinking, wouldn't it be nice to have some Coca-Cola, cold Coca-Cola? But they got there and they found that the owner of the pharmacy there, the little drugstore, wouldn't serve Japanese. So the situation that we recently almost saw happening in Indiana, with the law that they enacted and then thought better of and revised, is not a new one. And again, in a lot of these instances, she had no recourse. For me, when I was a toddler, there was a time when my parents took me to O'Hare Airport because we had some family friend who was coming through Chicago and had a layover. And this is long before the days when there were security. I mean, you could just like go to the airport and greet people coming off planes and spend some time with them. While we were there, a man decided that he wanted to stub out his cigarette and decided to use my forehead to do it. He claimed that I walked into the burning end of the cigarette. When I started school, there was an older red-haired boy who used to try to hit me and push me down, until a woman who happened to live in a house where we were walking by would see it, and she would run out and stop it, and she eventually called his mother. So the word bully was one of the earliest words in my vocabulary. Racism as a word was not yet a term of art. My parents saved their money. They wanted to buy a house, not a big house, but a modest house in a neighborhood where they thought the public schools were going to be a decent place for my sister and brother and I to attend school. When they were trying to have the closing, though, a local politician didn't want Japanese moving into the neighborhood, and so spoke to the bank and tried to put a stop to their ability to get a mortgage. And they didn't know what to do. And I tell you these stories, these incidents, not to say, oh, woe is me, you know, all these terrible things have happened, but to let you know that there's a lot of injustice. History is replete with incidents of injustice. Bad things happen to people. There are a lot of bad or stupid or ignorant or just bored or provocative people in the world. And sadly, we have to encounter them. And sometimes little things can rapidly become big things, as Walter Scott's family discovered. What's important, though, is how we choose to respond and what we choose to do. That ends up being what really matters. Because the choices end up being based on what we see as our own level of empowerment. I mean, what can we do? What abilities do we have? And when you are part of an underprivileged community, when you oftentimes feel downtrodden, when you look around and you see that perhaps the community from which you arise does not always have the same resources as other communities, it's easy to feel that you don't have a lot of choices. And that may be true for a lot of people, but I hope it won't be true for you. And law, I think, ends up being the key, because injustice is never tolerable. But it's a whole lot easier to cope with it when you feel that you are empowered to actually do something in response to it, something constructive. Consider Michael Brown's death and the resulting riots in Ferguson. Think about Eric Garner's death in New York. Hands up, don't shoot, I can't breathe. They were all plastered across the media this last year, but they're not new. People marched in the streets across the country because they were seeking a way to express their outrage and their anger and their frustration, their hurt. But what about, just a few years earlier? What about Trayvon Martin? It's not the first time these incidents have been happening. And let me tell you about a young man named Vincent Chin. Probably way too early for many of you to remember his name. In 1982, he was a young man attending his little bachelor party with some friends at a local strip club. Two unemployed white auto workers were in the same bar, and they were blaming their unemployment on the fact that at the time we had a lot of Japanese imports of cars coming into the country, and they felt that was the cause of their unemployment. And so even though Vincent Chin was not Japanese, had nothing to do with Japanese automobiles or their import or anything like that, he was a Chinese American, they chased him and they beat him to death in a nearby parking lot, and they never served a day in jail. Now, maybe these are just extreme examples of injustice, but I think they serve to illustrate my point, which is that injustice is nothing new. Sadly, it will likely persist, but it doesn't matter if it's one incident or more, and it's more or less egregious. What's really, it's irrelevant whether the victim was completely blameless. It happened. But if incidents of injustice continue to happen, what is much, much more important is how we respond to them and what we do. So now some young people, feel like, well, there's not a lot they can do. That they're young, but they're already so demoralized and so beaten down that they've almost given up, and so they opt out. And some think that, maybe the choice is violence. And that can range from, whether you decide to vandalize businesses in your local community to whether or not you try to get on a jet plane to go to Syria. It's an option. It's not one that I would recommend. Or even consider the Tsarnaev brothers, who rightly or wrongly thought that their response, having a bomb blow up amongst spectators at the Boston Marathon, that was their response. But these aren't really constructive responses. And what we need to think about are how can we be more constructive when outrageous, bad things happen, when injustice occurs. In the aftermath of 9/11, there was considerable talk amongst a lot of politicians about, those Muslims, they're living right in our midst. Maybe we need to, lock them up. Well, I'll tell you, my community heard about that in the 1940s, and we suffered it for 4 years. And I was really proud of the fact that when those conversations were percolating, that a lot of individuals from the Japanese American community decided that it was the time to make some outreach to the Muslim community to tell them, well, here's what happened to us, and you have rights. You have rights that perhaps we might not have had back in 1941, but you have it now, and we're going to make sure that you don't have to suffer as a community the way our community suffered. And so there are positive things that can come from these examples. When I was young, I grew up hearing stories about the injustices my family and their friends and my community had endured, and I decided that I wanted to change things for the better. Sort of what Keenan was talking about, using what our history has taught us to build upon it in a more positive way. And so I decided that I wanted to go to law school. I went to Harvard Law School, and as a lawyer, I have to say that one of my greatest joys have oftentimes come from being able to make changes for the better. And these don't always have to be huge, gigantic, enormous changes. I greatly admire the kinds of changes that Keenan and Senator and Mr. Conyers and others are going to effect for us. But sometimes each of us as individuals has responsibilities and opportunities that we can make change for the better. And when you have a law degree, sometimes that opens even more opportunities for the better that you can produce. It's like a mosaic. After enough pieces change, the whole picture changes. For me, I'm really proud of the fact that because of work I was able to do just with one other friend. There's one less racist judge sitting on the bench in Illinois. That we even have Asian judges on the bench now in Illinois, because as recently as 20 years ago, we didn't. For me, law has been a really positive outlet. But then again, this really isn't about me, it's more about you. There are many who will tell you not to go to law school. It's expensive, it's a lot of work, jobs aren't plentiful, lots of lawyers are miserable. Yeah, all true. But when you go to law school, if you do it for the right reasons, if you do it because you're not motivated simply because you think you're going to have a cushy lifestyle, although that's always nice if you're able to. If you do it because you're trying to make our society a fairer one, a better one, if you're trying to leave the world a better place than the way you found it, you could find no better profession in which to do it. The question boils down to, how do you want to spend your life? You can have a job, you could have a career, you could feel empowered. You could do something that's a little bit different, perhaps, and that allows you to see positive change. That can be sometimes just making sure justice is achieved for one individual, for an entire community, for a whole society. But if you're not there, if you're not in our ranks helping us, it's so much harder. We need you desperately. And there's so much you can do. I mean, I think that our generation has we've tried to do what we can, but there's a lot of work left. And as you've already heard, it's not easy to get to the point where you can be a lawyer to do it. But if you don't try, if you don't force yourself to do it, it won't happen at all. I can guarantee that. If it was easy, everyone would do it. So be prepared that, it's going to be hard, it's going to be tough, you're going to make sacrifices, and there are a lot of times when you're going to wonder, why is it falling on me? Because you're able to handle it. God's not going to throw anything at you that you can't handle. So with that, I will say thank you, and again, I hope that shortly we will all be welcoming you into our ranks as newly minted lawyers, prepared to take up the cause and help us make this world better. Thank you.